Welcome back. We are here again on YouTube and LinkedIn with another exciting episode of the Top Innovator Series. This is where we dive into proven leadership ideas and successful business strategies, and of course, the brilliant minds behind them. With us today, we're thrilled to have Garrick Villaume. Garrick is the owner of Physical Systems, a consulting firm that helps businesses with their business operations. And before that, he held tech executive roles for companies, including as the CTO for Global RAIS and Nuxsen. And today, we're thrilled to have him with us. Garrick, it's a pleasure to have you here in the conversation.
Hi, Joseph. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're super successful in your journey, Garrick. So we'd love to hear some of the ingredients of that success. When you reflect on your own journey, what do you think are some of the reasons? What are the ingredients that got you to where you are today?
For me, there's been a set of skills, right, and capabilities that have been core to my success. They've allowed me to, perform my jobs in a way that was, recognizable and help me lead and become a leader over time. And they largely center around inquisitiveness, desire to know why, right, determination to not let problems go if they haven't been resolved adequately, and I would say a fairly relentless tendency to pursue root cause, right? Why is something happening? Explain what the dynamics of a given situation are, which is what led me to physics as a profession, although personal circumstances then took me into industry.
Oh, fascinating. I'm a physicist as well by educational background, so that world totally fascinates me.
Right. I always loved it. Yeah.
So you're talking about looking at the root causes, right? And my physics mindset immediately goes to causality and linear connections, which is not the case in many leadership situations. So how do you untangle sort of the ambiguity that is very often in human situations? How do you grapple with that?
It's a great question, and there are some practices, right, and some principles that you should try to adhere to, right, that you should try to apply and cling to. But of course, no model, right, no framework is going to ideally describe, right, the situation and the system that you're working with, and no process is going to ideally execute whatever plan that you have. To me, the key is really bringing people into harmony, a word that I use in a general sense, which can include things like seeing the data the same way, recognizing the facts, right, in a certain way, agreeing on the nature of terms, understanding, what we value and distinguishing that from things that we don't want to value. It's really about helping people come into harmony, right, across these different dimensions and so on. And that then opens up it fuses the link, if you will, between what are the symptoms, what are the effects, right, what are the results, right, of the activity that we're doing, and the whys of our enterprise, our endeavors, right, but also then what's behind that in terms of who we are as beings, right, as creatures, and all of our desires.
Yep.
So it's a little bit maybe abstract, but that I spent a lot of time, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about models and cause and effects. That's why I went into particle physics, right? I wanted to kind of know what the basic nature of the structure of the universe was, right? I was inspired by Oppenheimer and Einstein and people like that, and then cosmos, right? I was at the age where it was a huge impact to me. I was in high school physics at the time that it was aired originally, right? And all of that sort of led me into this world of discovery, which then led to the world of shaping, right, and developing, and I'll use the word configuring, right, the natural world to be the world that we need to produce things, to make things, and so on.
Got it. I really like the term harmony in this context. Of course, the physicist in me is triggered by that. I think immediately of wave theory and everything that comes with it. That's a neat concept there. Now, when you think of your leadership journey, think back to your evolution and maybe some stages that you went through. What was a moment where you were surprised? What was a moment where you thought you have an idea of how something would be, how something would play out, and it ended up being very different?
That isn't uncommon if you consider a host of technical engineering product factory issues where, excuse me, frequently there were suggestions, ideas, right? Thoughts about what the problem was, and then it became a complicated process of validation, which then led you to things like applying Six Sigma methodologies and various practices, right, to get to rigorous problem solving, 8D, and so on. Which is why you do that, because it's hard. But to come back to the main question, to me, where I found things to be a little bit more surprising was reluctance to change, including in contexts where change was clearly needed or warranted by the current conditions. And two examples involve very large enterprise platforms for technical product engineering work, right? On the one hand, a requirements management system, on the other hand, a failure analysis network, right, of information acquisition and dissemination and so on, right, for validation and all these things. And there had been, the organization in this particular case, right, constantly complained and bemoaned about the state of the tools, right, and the issues and the islanding of different things. But then when you proposed and were working to develop the solution to that, excuse me, something caught in my throat. So in this context where there was widespread dissatisfaction, and that was pocketed and grouped, right, by various locations and functions and so on, but still fairly uniform, it turned out the reluctance to at first contribute to the creation of a solution for that, and then after a long period of actually working through that, ultimately adopting it, very difficult. And so to me, that was the big surprise about leadership, and the big lesson was the technical solution, the product solution is just a part, right, of the equation. That's factored in to these years later, and that was 20 years ago almost. That's factored in years later to the framework that I use, which is a fairly simple but I think elegant model for how you manage organizational change and transformation and so on. And it's connected to innovation processes and so on.
Okay, interesting. Do you mind saying a few more words about the model that you're using? It sounds like that's a key tool that you're using. So if you can share a bit more, just very briefly.
Yeah,
sort of headline version of that, maybe.
So thinking about all these experiences that I've had of trying to manage change and do product cycle after product cycle and so on and so forth, and then later doing startups, my tendency to want to figure out what's the basic dynamics, right? What are the system drivers that if you understand them, you might be able to manage them. I started to reduce, right, in the scientific sense, but not in the way that it gets criticized these days for Western science, right? But in the complex systems mode, if you will, which I've spent a lot of time in recent years sort of delving into that, right, as a recent update and complement to the background I have in physics, and applying this in a way that I think is digestible, not overwhelming, while being based on a very broad and deep foundation that ultimately rests on things like the same principles that underlie a lot of physics, like symmetry, relationships, and invariance, and things like that, and the fractal recursive nature of systems, and a thing that I call composition, which I won't go off into, but to me, there's a big aspect that we don't necessarily understand about the expressions, right, that the universe produces in a compositional sense, right? All the different things, right, that we see and how they make it. We know them a little bit, but not very much. Well, as I boil all that down and I say, well, what really matters, right, to an organization, right? And I'm presuming now an intelligent organization of mostly aligned people. Well, at the center of everything are people, right? It's the people. Without people, there is no plan, there's no strategy, there's nothing, right? There's no purpose, right? So there's this group of people, and this group of people is aligned to some degree or another, ideally strongly aligned around a purpose. They're also bound. They're bound by a set of shared precepts, is the word I use. So people, purpose, precepts.
Okay.
Who are you? What are you trying to accomplish? And why is that? Which is really the precepts, because you value thriving life, you value prosperity, you want money, right? Whatever it is, right? Those are the things that motivate you to go pursue this purpose and bring these people to bear on it. From that, then you can go apply a knowledge framework that I was working on in parallel with that.
Got it.
So,
okay, very cool. And I hear it's heavily leaning into physics again. Lovely model. Let me take a different look at your leadership journey. I'm sure you've had many mentors, trusted advisors, or people following you along and being at your side. When you think of the advice that you got from them, what was some advice you got that really sticks with you? Some advice that really resonated, that was important in your journey?
some of it came in conjunction with that lesson that I relayed here earlier. And it was, in the form of leadership, yin and yang, right? Carrot and stick, and balancing things like leading from above, right, versus leading from below, right? Either top down directive versus bottoms up grassroots acceptance, right? And how do you balance those two relative to the timing needs? And so I had some very salient advice that was part of my growing about working through opposition, right? Working through that inertia, right, that we talked about, and being sensitive to it, right? What are people's inner motivations, right? And then how do you get that to bring that out about them? And another lesson I learned is that, and this came from this was a lesson that I learned by watching somebody do something that wasn't good leadership, right? And so the lesson I took away was, don't do this, right? And it was, in a way that belittled, right, the person and diminished the person that was being talked to. And so in that case, it was particularly particularly sharp lesson, because the person who was doing it was not somebody I had expected to do something like that, was somebody that I had come to respect, right, over a period of many years, and had not seen this particular manifestation. And I believe it was triggered by extraordinary pressure and circumstances, and so that was a lesson about, how do you handle it when things aren't going well, right? And that was more by example, right, than by direct mentorship or coaching.
Got it. Okay.
There are so many others. Yeah. It's hard to say. But.
Yeah. Now, we talked about your past leadership journey. I'd like to take a look at where you are today, and not a question about companies or titles or projects. Again, about your leadership journey. When you think about where you are today, what is an area where you feel that there is room to grow? This is something I want to focus on. This is where I pay attention to in my own development, because you think there is a benefit to it. There is a lever to something that is useful.
So I'm in the twilight, right, of my career. I'm in a period of transitioning from a more technical, hands-on, direct work, right, around where is this going, what are we building, how are we going to do that, to what is the real objective, right, of the business, or how can we get this organization, right, to achieve some new operating condition or state that we want to achieve. I still have work to do when it comes to patience in the process of blending, of reaching harmony, right? Working through the difference of viewpoint that people bring, right, to every given situation, but then not being participative in the process of examination, right, of objectivity, right, that says, okay, here we're working together to do this. We know we're going to have, compromises to make, right, to put it in another sense. I'm going to, be a little bit more sophisticated and say different requirements that are, apparently contradictory that we have to solve, right, resolve to either make, to make a reliable product that works or a business that lasts, right, for a long time without polluting the environment, right, or what have you, right? So that process of synthesis, that process of achieving harmony, my patience and tolerance for contrary behavior, right, in the process, right? People who don't commit to the process, that's a challenge, right? And so how do you deal with that, right? As opposed to just say, leave the meeting, right, or get out of here, right, or you're not included, right, which then ends up compromising the process in a different way. Right. So getting people, I guess the short way to put that is getting people to participate sincerely without other motivations.
Yep, I got it. And with full commitment, right? It's easy to
I know. I'll just add to that, Joseph, by saying we've had a tendency, and I think this is part of the broader condition that we have for a long time, to advance form over function, right? To image is everything, right? To present friendly, to smile and nod like it's all okay, but in our mind we disagree. I was in an organization that had a terrible problem of people meeting and agreeing to something, and then they would split up and go to their separate departments, and they would undermine the results of the meeting. All right, I came into that thing from an outside world and entered into this ecosystem independent of it, only to see that it was a serious issue, right? It ended up bringing them down. It ended up bringing that company down ultimately. That was one of the 3 root causes of their demise. So.
Yep. A great summary line, form over function. You're absolutely right. Pretending that something is the case, whereas in reality it isn't. Something else is really the case. Yep.
Well, that's a cultural condition that we have.
Sure.
And
because it's easier, right? It's easier in many respects.
Right? To borrow the word that's attributed to Cory Doctorow, the enshittification of everything. Well, that's including leadership. Right? Leadership, if you will, has been trivialized in a way. I mean, come on, you got a 25-year-old punk, right, that's calling himself a CEO because he writes code and he runs a business, making websites or something like that, and that's a model. I mean, well, you're stretching the term to something that isn't even reasonable, right? Not that I'm some, corporate, act that says, oh no, you got to have 1,000 people. It's a change of basis that has, I think, eroded or reflects the erosion of values that we have for certain competencies.
Let me ask you one last question, Garrick, and then we're going to land the plane. If you had a magic wand and you could change something about how many tech leaders exercise their leadership, what change would you make?
It's all about their precept and their purpose. We're in a mode where the prevailing view is that you make value by making money, right? And that's led to this circular economy around AI, LLM that's going on right now, and it's been enabled by the concentration, right, of business through private equity, right, and the increasing monopolization of industrial sectors. If I could change anything, it would be get back to making value and then be happy that there's money that comes from making value, right? And it's really ironic because whether you're talking about lean startup method and the go out and visit the customer, don't try to work from your office, You don't try to solve the world's problems from your cube with your computer to what we're doing about provisioning power for people while data centers are consuming it, right, and everything in between. We've gotten into this view that says if we just drive profit, right, this is the growth model, right, the quarter on quarter thing and all that stuff, then that's good for everybody. But the first application of what used to be called results-based or outcome-based management says, in an objective look at the data, right, of our economies, right, in our system and the well-being of our population, says they're not working. They're not only not working, they're failing badly, right? And so this model, right, that says, oh, if we go drive all this activity that floats all these boats, that's wrong.
It's not the case.
We need to get back to purpose-driven business. Purpose means people, right?
Yep. I appreciate that thoughtful, and corrective element in what business should be, really. I also appreciate the callback to physics, or the draw on physics of any of the model. Garrick, it's been a real pleasure having you in the conversation. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Joseph.
To everyone else out there, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and most importantly, join us again for our next episode. And until then, keep your brain cells active.